All right. Hello. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. I am Bianca Castellanos. I'm the professor and chair of American Studies, and so I'm really delighted to see you all here virtually and on Zoom. So the Department of American Studies welcomes you to the annual David Noble Lecture. The lecture is held in honor of our dear friend and colleague, David Noble, who retired in 2009 and passed away in 2018. David wrote some of the most defining texts in American studies, including but not limited to The Paradox of Progressive Thought, Historians Against History, The End of American History, Democracy, Capitalism, and the Metaphor for Two Worlds in Anglo-American Historical Writing, Death of a Nation, American Culture and the End of Exceptionalism, and Debating the End of History, The Marketplace, Utopia, and the Fragmentation of Intellectual Life. I would like to thank our sponsors who helped make this event possible. I'd like to thank the Department of African American and African Studies, Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, Sociology, and Political Science, as well as the Institute for Advanced Study and the Center for Race, Gender, Indigeneity, Disability, and Sexuality Studies, also known as RIDGES. I would also like to thank all of you for your support for the David Noble Lecture Fund and the David Noble Graduate Research Fellowship Fund. The Graduate Fellowship helps support our excellent and diverse grad students. During his time at Minnesota, David directed over 100 dissertations. So this is a cause that was very dear to his heart. For those of you who are interested in continuing to support these funds, you can find more information on our website, americanstudies.umen.edu. I'd like to now introduce Professor Rose Brewer, who will be introducing Professor Harris. Dr. Rose Brewer is the Morse Alumni Distinguished Teaching Professor and past chairperson of the Department of African American and African Studies. She holds affiliate appointments in Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies and Sociology. Dr. Brewer is currently the interim chair of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. She received her MA and PhD degrees in sociology from Indiana University and did postdoctoral studies at the University of Chicago. An activist scholar, Professor Brewer publishes extensively on Black feminism, political economy, social movements, race, class, gender, and social change. She is one of the authors of the award-winning book, The Color of Wealth, a member of the co-edited volumes, including the U.S. Social Forum, Perspectives of the Social Movement, Bridges of Power, Women's Multicultural Alliances, and Is Academic Feminism Dead? Theory and Practice. Her most recent co-edited book is Rod Bush, Lessons from a Radical Black Scholar on Liberation, Love, and Justice. Her work includes more than 80 essays, articles, and periphery publications. Dr. Brewer is also the University of Minnesota College of Liberal Arts Dean's Medalist, a member of the Academy of Distinguished Teachers, and a winner of the American Sociological Association's Distinguished Teaching Award, and many, many more. So I would like to would like you all to please join me in welcoming Dr. Brewer. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good evening, everyone. It's with great pleasure and pride that I introduce Professor Duchess Harris, my former student and dissertation advisee. What can the teacher say when the student flies? Just that I'm humbled and filled with respect. Professor Harris was born in Virginia, and she attended the Canterbury School in Connecticut. She received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and her PhD from the University of Minnesota in American Studies. Professor Harris was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on Race and Poverty, University of Minnesota Law School, under direction of John Powell. She later received her JD Law degree from the William Mitchell College of Law, St. Paul, Minnesota. Professor Harris was a founding member of Macalester College's American Studies Department. She is currently the chair and has served as chair for 8 years, including as its inaugural chair. Her honors are numerous. Dare I begin to cite them. But let's start with 1997. Her doctoral dissertation, From Kennedy to Combahee, Black Feminist Activism, from 1960 to 1980, was nominated for the Ralph Henry Gabriel Prize, and she'd only just begun. Her 2018 book, Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Trump, is a definitive investigation of the mainstreaming of Black feminist politics in the 21st century. Following on the success of Black feminist politics from Kennedy to Clinton and Black feminist politics from Kennedy to Obama, she now extends that work to Black feminist politics from Kennedy to Kamala, the title of tonight's lecture. She incorporates the Black women leaders of Black Lives Matter, contemporary Black feminist political stars like Representative Maxine Waters, and the transformative influence of Black feminist political strategy and principles in mainstreaming US politics, especially in the 2016 US election. Professor Harris will conclude her talk by asking, are Black women political elites like Vice President Kamala Harris, daughters of Combahee, or merely benefactors of those who have lived and are living a Black feminist praxis? Having shared just a bit of her impressive biography, and with so much more to say, let us give a warm welcome to Professor Duchess Harris, the 2022 David Noble Lecturer in American Studies. Professor Harris.
Oh my goodness. So I just found out before this began that Professor Brewer was going to introduce me. And there's something about your dissertation advisor calling you definitive. I could not have imagined that 30 years ago. So I'm here tonight just feeling so much gratitude. And you know, I'm appreciative for the American Studies faculty for inviting me to what feels like home. I'm so glad to be here. I'm glad to see my colleague from Macalester, Professor Julie Rogers, my colleague who's online, Professor Tia Simone Gardner, who helped me think through this talk, my methods class at Macalester, and of course, my husband of 27 years, John Thomas. Also, I have to give a major shout out to Amy Puczynski, who allowed me to make changes to my slides at 1:30 this afternoon, and who also made the cookies that are out there. So, you know, this is just tremendous. So I'm wondering if there is someone that can help me pull up my slides, just show me where they are. There we go. Excellent.
There we go.
Nope.
Just down button.
Yeah, great. Thank you. All right. So on a night like tonight, I am feeling nostalgic. It was actually 25 years ago this month that I defended my dissertation. And I could not have imagined this moment. Because I'm feeling nostalgic, I want to reflect on my first few months of graduate school. So I moved out here in the fall of 1991. I was 22 years old, and I'd never left the East Coast before, and I didn't really understand the landscape of the Midwest. And so I came without a car, right? I figured there'd have to be public transportation. I was wrong. On Halloween, we had a blizzard, 26 inches of snow. I'm walking to the bus, riding the bus when it came. Sometimes it didn't. I didn't get invited to Paisley Park. I was quite disappointed. I was the only Black student in the department. I wanted to go home. Because I couldn't afford long distance calls, Al Gore hadn't invented the internet, I was often glued to the television. So when I was glued to the television, I watched the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings every day that they aired. Even though Anita Hill was a Republican social conservative, she was a Black woman who was a professor. And that was my dream. I watched Senator Biden conduct a public spectacle, and it left us with Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. The damage that Thomas has done in the last 30 years is still with us, to the point that we realize now that his wife was sending text messages to Donald Trump's chief of staff days before the storming of the Capitol on January 6th of this year. Learning about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill in graduate school shaped the research that I'm sharing tonight. And so I really am feeling tremendous gratitude. So as I continue to extend gratitude, I'm honored to be here this evening because the person who convinced me not to drop out of graduate school, and I really did want to leave, and not go back to the East Coast, was none other than Professor David Noble. Now, I had no idea what to make of Professor Noble when I met him. I'm embarrassed to say that I thought he was an old man. And I realize now that he was only 13 years older than I am at this moment. So it's pretty humbling, and I know what my students think of me. I didn't understand everything that he shared in class, but I realized that his musings on the nation state would become the 2002 publication, Death of a Nation, American Culture, and the End of Exceptionalism. And now I teach that book. Let's see. All right. I'm glad that Professor Noble chastised me for not dressing warmly enough, which is something I still do, and convinced me to stay in school because he helped me find a dream team of 5 women. And I had no idea that she was going to introduce me. So this is a lesson to my students that you always honor the people who trained you. So this was my dream team, my dissertation chair and the women on my committee. And I also feel like I need to say that I stand on the shoulders of Professor John Wright, who was the first Black person to get a degree in this program. And then Professor Indesha Ida Mae Holland, who was the second Black person to get a degree in this program. And because they walked through these doors, it allowed me to be the 3rd Black graduate to get a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. So if you had told me when I was graduating 25 years ago that the Vice President of the United States would have a name like Kamala, and that Joe Biden would end up being president and making up for his mistreatment of Anita Hill by now nominating and today confirming Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, that would have been hard to believe. But here I am today looking at the fact that I have done this research that allows us to think about that. When the first edition of my book came out in 2009, I made an argument that presidential politics has always struggled with race, class, and gender. In 2022, this seems like a simple enough argument, but the first person to offer this new perspective on how Black political thought and behavior is influenced by grassroots organizing after the '65 Voting Rights Act was Melissa Harris Lacewell. Her book, Barbershops, Bibles, and BET, came out 3 years before Obama was elected. My book came out 6 months after he took office. So this is another moment to express some gratitude. Who inspired my research? So I was a Mellon Mays Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and my academic advisor, one of many, was Dr. Mary Frances Berry. And when I went to her office hours, she suggested that I read the work of Paula Giddings. And at the time, this was new work, but now is considered a classic. And this is the text, When and Where I Enter, the Impact of Black Women on Race and Sex in America. In this text, Giddings explains that Black men articulated a political agenda in 1963 at the March on Washington. And they were a particular kind of Black men. They were mostly Southern Black men, many Baptist preachers. They were straight men because they didn't want Bayard Rustin to be up front, even though he had organized the march. She also brings to our attention that that same year, the political agenda for middle-class white women was articulated in Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. And so she asks, in 1963, who has presented the political agenda for Black women? This ends up prompting me to engage her work. And this is when and where I enter with these two questions as I go to graduate school. And the questions are, what did Black women do to gain political power in the late 20th century? And the second question, why in many cases did they not succeed? And so in 1963, you get the proceedings of John F. Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women published. And so what's significant about this is that John F. Kennedy pulls together this commission between 1961 and 1963. It's chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, who actually passes away in 1962. Now, the good thing about this is that it's the first presidential commission to acknowledge that Black women had different public policy concerns from Black men and white women. What was concerning, however, is that none of the Black women's suggestions were included in the final report, and I found the report here in the archives at the University of Minnesota, and they were not covered in the New York Times coverage. Now, one of the reasons why this is a problem is that they had numerous suggestions, and one of the suggestions that they had were the seeds that ended up becoming Head Start. So we did end up getting Head Start in 1965, but people didn't know that those conversations had already started with this group of women. And to give you an idea of who was on the Black Women's Consultative Body, it was chaired by Dr. Dorothy Height, but one of the members was Lorraine Hansberry, who was considered a radical, partly because she was a critic of the Kennedy administration. She had a meeting with Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and criticized him, and he did not appreciate it. And so for the moment, the fact that they were even trying to talk about race and gender was more than what the country was ready for. To give you more idea of context of what this moment was in 1963, the report is released 2 months after the March on Washington, 1 year before Fannie Lou Hamer spoke before a segregated Democratic National Convention where the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is looking for their delegation to be seated and it does not get seated, and 2 years before the Voting Rights Act is passed. That's important because Black women are not voting in elections until the Voting Rights Act is passed, and that, of course, is in 1965. So in 1966, you get two organizations that come along that everyone in this room is familiar with, and that's the Black Panther Party and the National Organization for Women. Black women are involved in both the Panther Party and the National Organization for Women, but they felt some isolation in both of these organizations. One of the reasons why they felt that way is that they felt that they had to choose between their race or their gender. And one policy issue that they were concerned with was reproductive rights and freedom. So for instance, the Panthers wanted Black women to have babies for the revolution. The middle-class white women in now were interested in getting the birth control pill federally recognized, and that ends up happening in '69. What the Black women, and I have to say Latina women as well, were interested in was talking about forced sterilization. And so that's what was happening to many women of color. That actually happened to Fannie Lou Hamer, where she was sterilized against her will, and people ended up calling that procedure a Mississippi appendectomy. And so after the Voting Rights Act is passed, what you get are many Black men who decide that they want to be members of Congress. And so you get the Congressional Black Caucus. And as you can see, the only woman who has a seat at the table is Shirley Chisholm. And so when Shirley Chisholm is in Congress, she is inspired to represent her district. And in 1972, she decides that she wants to run for president. as we know, her slogan is unbought and unbossed. Now, Shirley Chisholm ends up being very disappointed when she realizes that the men who are in Congress with her will not support her bid for presidency. In fact, the only two members of the Congressional Black Caucus that support her are Ron Dellums from California and Perrin Mitchell from Maryland. She then goes to the National Organization for Women, and Gloria Steinem does support her, but many of her colleagues in that organization do not. She takes this information and realizes that there probably should be an organization where Black women can talk about race and gender. And so she becomes one of the founders of the National Black Feminist Organization in 1973. So who are her colleagues? She is joined by Alice Walker, who becomes the famous novelist, and I'm going to talk about her a little bit later in this talk. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was not in Congress then, but it is now. Florence Kennedy, who was a lawyer in New York, and one of her big claims to fame is that she helped represent Billie Holiday when Billie Holiday was brought up on charges for drug possession. And then Margaret Sloan, who was one of the few Black women that was a founder of Ms. Magazine. And of course, Ms. Magazine continues to this day to have tremendous influence in terms of putting forth a gender justice agenda. So what did the NBFO do? Well, for 6 years, they attempted to fight patriarchy in the Black community. But as one of their members, Michelle Wallace, says, for straight women, action became unthinkable. So what's going on is actually that these are 20-something women, right? Like many of the students that we teach, who want to talk about, dismantling patriarchy, but also want to date. Now, that's not always the easiest thing to do. That's what students tell me. I lucked out. I didn't have that experience. So, and Michelle Wallace, for those of you all who don't know, she wrote this great book called Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. And not only that, she's the daughter of the still living Faith Ringgold, who's in her 90s, who is the quilt maker and artist. So the Boston chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization broke off. And they said, you know what, we don't have any problem with this patriarchy thing because we're lesbians. So they were like, you guys get your boyfriends, we have an agenda. I love this photo because it makes me realize how young they were, right? So in my mind, the great leaders of Combahee are just these women of stature, and they were women of stature, but at the time, they were very young women. So a little bit about why they call themselves the Combahee River Collective. Because they're in Boston, they are concerned that Northerners might not know the stories of Southern Blacks. And the Combahee River is in South Carolina. And it's actually the place where Harriet Tubman would lead people who'd been enslaved through the water to lose their scent to go to freedom. And so they knew that if people said to them, Combahee River, like, what is that? What does that mean? It would put them in a position where they were always telling the story, always providing the oral history, leaving the narrative. So that is the significance. So what did they do? When they were in Boston, they helped establish the first battered women's shelter. And this would have been in the 70s. In 1979, there were 12 Black women who were murdered within 2 miles in 5 months. Now, the Boston Globe was reporting this on page 30. And it was because of their action, this ends up going to the A section. So it's closer to being front page news. So let's put this in a Minnesota context, right? What if 12 white women were killed between 48th and 50th of France in Edina? Right? Do we not think that would be front page news? And so this was the kind of work that they did. They also got involved in the case of a Black woman who was incarcerated at Framingham State Prison. One of the guards tried to rape her in self-defense. She killed him. And then, the prison was trying to figure out how they could punish her even more. What I want to bring to your attention is that this is a precursor to abolition feminism, right? They're not using that language. They're not, using that terminology, but we can see that this is happening in the 70s. So the Combahee River Collective statement, any student who's taken Introduction to Gender, Women's, Sexuality Studies has probably had this on their syllabus. And the thing that makes this statement significant, it was published in 1977. It's the first political document that uses the terminology identity politics, right? This is the first place that happens. And it is the first political manifesto that says that race, gender, socioeconomic status, and sexuality should be taken into consideration. So it's anti-capitalist, right? Which is also very different than MBFO, and definitely different if you're reporting to John F. Kennedy. And also, they're really talking about what it means to have lesbian identity in a patriarchal society. So why was the collective important to scholarship in academia? These women, Gloria Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith, whom I was fortunate enough to interview them all, they put together this anthology, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. This is the first book that can be looked at as Black women's studies. It's also the moment where courses on Black women, particularly Black women's literature, are taught in the academy. So Alice Walker teaches the first class on Black women's literature in the early 80s at Wesleyan. One of the reasons why this resonates with me is that I went to college in 87. So if this work hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been able to study what I was able to study. And I'm the youngest of four. My two oldest siblings did not have access to this kind of information. So the 1970s is met with like lots of moments of creativity for Black women. You have Ntozake Shange, who writes the choreo poem for Colored Girls. But one of the things that really just like launched Black women into mainstream pop culture discussions was the publication of Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, which also, of course, becomes a major box office hit. It's put out by Steven Spielberg. What you can't see by the slide, what it says up there is that there's resistance with Black masculinity and with the dominant culture. So the resistance with Black masculinity, I have on good authority that when there were meetings at the Modern Language Association after this book came out, there were arguments about the character Mr., her portrayal of Black men, and people have told me that chairs were thrown. I can't say who told me that because I'm on Zoom, but I think it's true. And so, we have this explosion of Black women trying to be creative, but we know that there's going to be pushback. And so in the pushback, we have backlash in the 1980s. And so what I'm going to do now is read from some of my favorite parts of the book. And this is the section where I go from talking about the novel, The Color Purple, being like a highbrow threat, because that's something that's happening at MLA, but how people who just read magazines, Vanessa Williams, the crowning of her as Miss America becomes a lowbrow threat. So when Alice Walker's novel, while it might have represented a highbrow threat to Black masculinity and the dominant culture, the 1983 crowning of Vanessa Williams was a pop culture threat in the era of Reagan. To understand exactly what it was that Vanessa Williams represented and how her fall from grace constituted a threat to her symbolic accomplishment, it is first necessary to understand some of the dominant tropes used by politicians that cast Black women into the unidimensional role of the welfare queen. One of Ronald Reagan's favorite anecdotes on the campaign trail, both in 80 and 84, was the story of the Chicago welfare queen, who had 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, and a tax-free income of over $150,000. Now, this supposedly true story represented a melding of resentments against the poor. Reagan's depiction of the welfare queen was based on a woman from Chicago, Linda Taylor, who had been charged with welfare fraud in 1976. She was actually charged with defrauding the state $8,000, not $150,000. Not only was Taylor misrepresented, but the president's extensive use of the welfare queen narrative served to permanently consolidate racist stereotypes of Black women within contemporary political discourse. And so I feel like I need to pause there because I often tell students, you just hear that phrase and don't realize that it actually came out of the White House and what the implications of that are and what it means when we talk about politics. Are all politics coming from Capitol Hill, or can politics come from outside of that? Okay. When Vanessa Williams was crowned, former Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm said at the time, Williams's coronation, because it doesn't put bread on the table, people might say, so what, when considering the importance to the civil rights movement. But Chisholm says, it's not trivial because it shows, in a sense, that the country, for whatever the motivation might be, seems to be trying desperately to move toward an egalitarian set of circumstances. So one thing I like to point out here as well is because students and, my kids, they have pop culture images of women of color who are considered beautiful everywhere, right? They've been socialized in Rihanna and Beyonce and all this. This was the first time, and I was in the 10th grade when she won Miss America, the first time that you saw a woman of color that was celebrated by the mainstream. And Shirley Chisholm, who was a dark-skinned sister from the Caribbean, said, even though she's fair-skinned, even though she has light eyes, we should at least think that there will be a movement. So Williams's success and the narrative constructed around it was not to last. And this is the part where we think about people's motivations. So in July 1984, Penthouse ran an issue that featured Vanessa Williams nude. These photographs, taken 3 years before the pageant, were the reason the Miss America Commission asked Williams to relinquish her crown in title. She is the only Miss America that's ever had to give up her crown. Vanessa Williams becomes an Icarus figure who flew too high and then she falls. Once she loses her crown, many people in the Black community feel betrayed, right? Because there was a tremendous sense of pride around Vanessa Williams. Also partly too because of the family that she came from. She came from like this very solidly middle-class, respectable background that a lot of people at that time, particularly in this Reagan moment, were saying like, see, we are good people, right? This is also in the moment of the Cosby Show when people are trying to show in pop culture, see, we can be good, dignified people. So a lot of Black people saw her exploitation as the quintessential act of resistance against Black women in the 1980s. She was our exemplary queen of the 80s, and she's quickly replaced by the quota and condom queens of the 90s. And so this is setting the stage for the Clinton administration, which my first edition of the book just goes up to the Clinton administration. So there's a huge chunk in the book I have to leave out due to time constraints. And one section is, I won't be talking about the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill incident tonight, but I will mention, however, that in 1991, there were only 4 Black women in Congress and only 2 chose to speak in favor of Anita Hill. They were Eleanor Holmes Norton from the National Black Feminist Organization, and of course, Maxine Waters. Also, just so you know, there are only 4 white women in the entire Senate. And so these hearings and the way that Anita Hill was treated by a Senate that was 96 white men and 4 white women pushed us into 1992, which ends up being the year of the woman, and people decide women are going to run for all of these elected positions and we're going to change electoral politics. So one of the women that gets elected in 1992 is Carol Moseley Braun, who wins a Senate seat in Illinois, becoming the first Black woman ever to serve in that capacity. And as we know, the second Black woman to hold a Senate seat is now vice president. So currently there are no Black women in the Senate. There also has never been a Black woman governor. When Moseley Braun ran for re-election, despite the fact that President Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, and First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton all flew to Illinois to campaign on her behalf and to help her raise funds, she was defeated by a male Republican whose personal wealth estimated $40 million. Carol Moseley Braun's unsuccessful Senate term occurred during the Clinton era. Now, many Black women were hopeful about the possibilities of the Clinton era. Part of it is that, his machine marketed him as, a guy from Hope. He's from Hope, Arkansas. And then, of course, he chooses Maya Angelou as his inaugural poet. And he made promises that he was going to put Black people in his cabinet. Shortly after his inauguration, Clinton nominated his friend and former classmate, Lani Guinier, to the prestigious and crucial post of Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. Guinier's nomination sparked an immediate firestorm and criticism from the right, and they labeled her a quota queen. And the reason why they're calling her a quota queen is because she's writing legal articles that are talking about redistricting, and the right is accusing her of wanting to draw district lines so that there are racial quotas so that you can have people of color in Congress, which really isn't what's happening. And we actually found out that people are either not reading her work or clearly misunderstanding it. And so one of her friends says that what she experiences is a low-tech lynching. And this, of course, is riffing on the fact that when Clarence Thomas is going through his hearing, he refers to it as a high-tech lynching. In the midst of all the chaos, Clinton backs down, not only withdrawing his nomination, but also refusing to let Guinier the opportunity to speak in her own defense. And so the result is a civil rights setback. Unfortunately, the Guinier embarrassment was followed by the scandal that engulfed Dr. Joycelyn Elders, whom Clinton nominates in July of the same year, and he nominates her to be Surgeon General. Joycelyn Elders gets the Surgeon General position, but she ends up being forced to resign in just a little more than a year. Her brief tenure exemplifies Black women's struggle to gain stature in the Democratic Party in general, but in Bill Clinton's cabinet in particular. Surgeon General Joycelyn Elders was unceremoniously marked a condom queen as a result of her position in which she advocated the availability of condoms in public schools as a public health strategy for halting the spread of HIV and AIDS. And we should remember, like at this moment, AIDS is really a tremendous problem. The following comment led to her being called a condom queen. She said, "Condoms are not the government's solution to the teenage pregnancy crisis, but we want to make condoms available to those who choose to be sexually active. I'm not in the opinion that just because you have a condom, you're going to go out and have sex. There's not a person in this room that doesn't have car insurance, but you're not going to go out and have a wreck because of it." So this is what she says at a physician's meeting. And I need to emphasize that because you could say, was she talking at a middle school? Was she talking to teachers? Was she talking, to kids in the room? It's at a medical meeting. So on December 9th, 94, Clinton asked her to resign after she's answered these questions at this professional meeting. And Clinton says, well, I'm sorry. We just can't have any more of this. I want your resignation by 2:30 p.m. Now, an ousted official normally is permitted to maintain the illusion that she's voluntarily stepped aside. There's a polite exchange of letters, right? There's usually some kind of decorum around this. But the White House took great pains to make clear that Clinton had demanded that Elders leave. Now, if we are to evoke karma, the Monica Lewinsky scandal happens 4 years later. So, just saying. All right, so the next section of my book is called Staying Out of the Bushes. On November 7th, 2000, Al Gore thought he had lost the presidency, but wasn't sure. After originally conceding the election, he retracted his concession and demanded a recount in what became, at the time, the closest presidential election in American history. Vice President Al Gore led by the popular vote, which we know is different from the Electoral College. In the 2000 election, the NAACP launched the biggest voter drive in its 91-year history, spending more than $10 million to encourage what civil rights leaders were saying at the time was the biggest Black voter turnout in decades. Voting records confirmed that Black voters in Florida and around the country turned out in mass numbers. Yet after the election, many complained that Florida election officials removed large numbers of minorities from state voting rolls, wrongly classifying them as convicted felons. Florida elected officials were also accused of using police to intimidate voters in some areas. So under the direction of Dr. Mary Frances Berry, who while teaching at Penn was also the head of the US Commission on Civil Rights, they undertook an investigation into these allegations by these Floridians about the voter irregularities. However, it doesn't change the outcome. As we all know, Bush wins. 10 months after assuming his position in the Oval Office, George Bush was faced with the bombing of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001. Most Americans outside of Oakland, California, didn't know much about California's 9th District US Representative Barbara Lee. However, on September 15th, 2001, the Senate passed a use of force resolution and the House overwhelmingly approved it, 420 to 1. Congresswoman Barbara Lee was the lone dissenting voice. Lee's resistance to Bush's domination provided a new model of Black female leadership. Now, just as like a side note, when I was trying to get my book contract, when I was young and naive, I was pitching my book and I said, and I have this great argument, and the argument is that Barbara Lee is a hero. And then I, for the life of me, couldn't figure out why I couldn't get my contract at first. But, you know, we mature. So when we go into the second edition of my book, that brings us to the Obama years. So Obama's administration began with promise. With the election of Obama came the appointment of the most diverse cabinet in history. 30% of Obama's cabinet appointments were women, 39% were Black, Latino, and Asian. Among these appointments were many Black women. US Ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice. Lisa P. Jackson was made the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Melody Barnes was the director of domestic policy. Mona Sutphin, deputy chief of staff for policy. And Peggy Hamburg was the commissioner for the Food and Drug Administration. Initially, African-American women occupied about 7 of the 36 senior positions in the Obama administration. In addition to the appointment of a number of Black women to his administration and staff, during the first months in office, Obama took several actions that showed solidarity and support for women. The first bill he signed into law was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Restoration Act. Less than 2 months later, he signed an executive order to create the White House Council on Women and Girls. These efforts, the bill, the council, and the diversity of the administration showed that Obama was trying to keep Black women in mind. But upon closer inspection, similar to the Clinton years, Black women continue to have struggles. So if we look at one of his first Black women appointees to step down, we have Desiree Rogers. Desiree Rogers had been a personal friend of the Obamas from their years in Chicago. She takes a $200,000 pay cut, because remember, it's a government job, to become the social secretary for the White House. When she takes this position on, the White House ends up having a dinner with the heads of state from India. Now, I know there's someone in the audience who loves popular culture, so I will evoke the Real Housewives of Washington, D.C. because I know you're feeling me, Elliot, right? And so what happens is one of the Real Housewives decides that she wants to go to the state dinner, but they're not on the list. So she puts on a gorgeous silk sari, her husband puts on a tux, and they manage to finagle their way in. Okay. Now, instead of blaming the Secret Service, for some reason, the Obama administration gets mad at Desiree Rogers. And Desiree Rogers is like, I'm living like a poor person. I only make $150,000 a year. I don't need this. I'm going to quit. And so when she quits, the New York Times actually acknowledges the fact of what it meant for her to be in that position and how challenging it would be. And so someone wrote up that, you know, the spotlight was going to be put on her in a different way. She's not a Washingtonian. She's in this high profile senior role. She's the first Black person to have this role. And the combination makes it so that it's not easy, a very large mountain to climb. And so this is actually the beginning of Black women who have some struggles. The next is Melody Barnes, who refuses to say why she's leaving. But of course, you know, there's always Washington scuttlebutt. And there was a sense that she felt like she was not treated well. However, I think the best example of how much a Black woman struggled in Obama's administration is the case of Shirley Sherrod. So I'll just read a little bit here. On March 27th, 2010, Shirley Sherrod, the USDA's Georgia Director of Rural Development, gave a 40-minute speech at an NAACP event. During the speech, she shared her background with the audience, including the murder of her father in 1965 by two white men who were never indicted. She continued by relating an anecdote from her time working as the director of a nonprofit that aided Black farmers. Okay. So she's talking about years before when she worked at this nonprofit. And she spoke frankly about how when a white farmer came to her for help, at first she wasn't enthusiastic about helping him. She does say, however, she agreed to work with him and that she learned from this moment because what she ended up learning, she says, is that, you know, her quote here is, working with him made me see that it's really about those who have versus those who don't. And you could be Black, you could be white, you could be Hispanic. It made me realize that I needed to work to help poor people, those who don't have access the way others have. Okay, so this is the story. 4 months later, conservative blogger Andrew Breitbart posted a 2-minute, 38-second clip of Sherrod's speech on his website, biggovernment.com. Breitbart edits it so it sounds as though she's not helping the white farmer. He also misrepresents the story and makes it so that the story happens while she's in Obama's cabinet, not years before when she was working at the nonprofit. And so when he posts this doctored video, as you can imagine, Fox News runs with it. And so conservative talk show host Bill O'Reilly goes on his show in the afternoon and talks about how terrible it is that this kind of person is in the Obama cabinet. And so what happens is that someone from his administration, without checking into any of the details, actually relying on getting news from Bill O'Reilly, calls Sherrod to the point she's driving down the interstate. They call her so many times, they ask her to pull over and resign from her BlackBerry on the side of the road. Okay. So by the next day, people realize that she's been wronged. And so President Obama ends up calling her and personally apologizing to her and asking her to return to the position. And she actually declines. She does say, however, I would like to talk to the president about the experiences of people like me, people at the grassroots level, people who live in rural America, people who live in the South. I don't think he has that kind of experience. Let me help him a little bit with how we think, how we live, and the things that are happening. And so I teach a class on the Obama presidency. And one of the things that I remind students is that His mother is a white American. His dad is from Kenya. He really has no relatives in his family who are American descendants of slavery. He lives in Kansas, Indonesia, Hawaii, New York, and Chicago. None of that is the South, right? And so he's not really connected to that. So in an op-ed column, Maureen Dowd suggested that anyone with knowledge of the civil rights movement would have recognized the name Sherrod. The Reverend Charles Sherrod co-founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. He's Shirley's husband. And so this is an indication of where some Black Americans are starting to wonder how this is working, right? So South Carolina Congressman James Clyburn, member of the Congressional Black Caucus, said he didn't think a single Black person had been consulted before the decision to fire Sherrod was made. And Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton said, the president needs some advisors or friends who have a greater sense of the pulse of the African-American community. And so sadly, Sherrod's forced resignation makes us think about Lonnie Guinier and Joycelyn Elders, snubs that happened in the Clinton administration. And so one of the things we have to think about is that, of course, the presidency isn't a person, right? It is an office, it's an operation, it's a machine. And even if you are the first Black president, this can happen. Now, granted, Obama's not directly responsible for Sherrod's resignation, particularly since I don't think his people were talking to him. But nevertheless, he missed some opportunities to fill his administration with people that would have understood these things. Now, even after her unfair treatment, Sherrod says, we love him. We want him to be successful. We want him to be in office because he thinks like we do, right? Which some folks might say, a little bit yes, a little bit maybe not. And so I argue in my the second edition of this book that no matter who's in the White House, access to political culture, either organizing outside of it or being within it, is still difficult for Black women. So now I will start closing out and I'll move to my third edition. Okay, so after you get the Obama years, we realized that we're going to have another race. Now, 94% of Black women voted for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Now, notice I said voted for. I didn't say Black women were with her. And this slide is for Elliot. There's Prince saying, girl, I guess I'm with her, right? And one of the reasons why Black women felt this way, and honestly, all the interview data shows that white women indicted Hillary for Bill's behavior more than Black women did. Black women could separate. They were like, that was him. It's not about him. This is about you. And about Hillary Clinton's stance on policing and her hesitance to embrace Black Lives Matter. Even though they were not enthusiastic, they did what they were told. They knew the assignment, okay? And Black women actually voted more of a block for Hillary than any other constituency in the nation. And in fact, 52% of white women voted for Trump. And so, am I getting an amen out there? So most of us never thought what was going to happen would happen. We were trying to stay out of the bushes, right? We did not think that things would get worse. They did. So when Trump becomes elected, he barely tries. He puts one Black woman in his administration. She's TV personality Omarosa. Now, Trump can't even keep it clean with Omarosa, right? They have a big falling out. She decides she's going to profit off of it. She writes a book. Of course, it's a #1 New York Times bestseller because there's nothing good to read about the presidency other than maybe what Omarosa thinks. So she writes Unhinged, an insider's account of the Trump White House. I'm not even going to talk about his presidency because this is a lovely evening and this is my talk, and I'm just not going to centralize that. And so despite those 4 years, I have to say the future is bright. So Black feminist futures and activism can be looked at by the 3 founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors, who are also queer, who also like evoked an organizational strategy similar to Combahee, that they operated as a collective and didn't have a hierarchical leadership. Black feminist futures and activism also can be seen in the work of Tarana Burke, who actually was the first person to say Me Too. And when women in Hollywood tried to hijack that, she was able to bring it back. Black feminist futures in Congress are in front of the Capitol here, Congresswoman Cori Bush, who was a first responder. She was a nurse in Ferguson when Michael Brown was killed. She's inspired by everything that's happened in Ferguson, and she ends up running for Congress. Then you have Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who's a part of the squad, that they're on the movement, similar to the way that we have the 1992 Year of the Women. In 2018, we get lots of women of color in Congress. I understand she's holding a copy of her favorite book. I can't imagine how that happened. And then finally, on a day like today, a day that we can celebrate like no other, the future is now, and now we have a Black woman on the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. And so I will end there and just open up for conversation. And I don't know if it works, if people on Zoom can ask questions either. I don't know how that works. Okay. Oh,
Chat. So I'm just going to open the chat.
fab. Okay.
Anybody would like to join? Please feel free to ask any questions on Zoom. So we've got it open so she can answer live.
Oh, I see you, Kale. Kale's in there like, go with the print slide. I'm telling you, it was for Elliot. So comments, like I said, that we would talk about, I think it's kind of delicate, do political elites, elected and appointees and confirmed, like Kamala and Ketanji, are they like descendants of Combahee? Do they benefit from it? Are they somehow connected to it? That's one of the things I'm thinking about. And it's nice to have an audience that remembers these things, because I demoed this on Tuesday to all of my students who were born after 2000. And they were like, wow, we heard of some of those people. And I was like, special. Yeah, Bionette. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure, sure. I mean, the fact that this was 45 years ago, right? And to think that, people say intersectionality all the time, but Kim Crenshaw writes her, legal analysis of that in 93. This is 77, right? And so the distance between 77 and 93, people didn't even know what they were looking at, right? People couldn't even process it. The question, it was just a comment that Bionette had said that she had taught the statement to her class in the fall, and how the students were remarking on how relevant the Combahee River Collective statement was for organizing now, like in 2021 and 22. Yeah, Jennifer.
I loved getting to see the picture of everyone in the Combahee River Collective when they're so young.
Yeah.
I just realized I've seen only pictures of Barbara Smith
Yeah.
as a middle-aged or
Right.
older woman and that kind of thing. So I love seeing that. But I also wanted you to say a little bit more about the continuity of the Combahee River Collective politics, because I certainly see that in someone like Shirley Sherrod,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not so sure I see it like if you think back to Vanessa Williams or some of the other women that Black women you've talked about. So I wondered if you could talk more about that.
I think one of the ways in which it connects to Vanessa Williams is how our conversations around sexual politics have changed, right? And so when I tell students that she lost her crown because of nude pictures, they're like, we got nude pictures on our phone, right? Like that has become like so much more like normative. But there's also there's issues of queerness as well, right? So one of the things I didn't get to in the talk is that she is being photographed with a woman, right? And they are both naked, and they are in the midst of some kind of erotic act. And then when you think about how this is pre-internet, so it's like on the national news, and I'm talking like morally safer, right? Then they put the pictures up, and then like parts of their bodies are blacked out. And so now what would be considered like maybe either everyday or mild erotica, that was considered hardcore porn, because it wasn't Playboy, it was Penthouse, right? And it's also in a moment that, like in the Reagan moment, everything is about heteronormative families, everything is nuclear, and so much so that the biggest pop culture influence in terms of television at the time is Cosby, with the argument that the mom can be a lawyer, the dad can be an OBGYN, 5 high functioning kids, in Brooklyn Heights, like the whole thing. And so that is really about the 80s, in that that was considered kind of just like a spurn against not just society in general, but it's also a class thing, right? So middle class Black people were like, we were just getting thought of as like humans and citizens, and now they're taking out like the emblem that represents the value that we have, right? Really messy, complicated stuff. Yeah, please.
This is a really new thing. I was just wondering if you knew anything about it, considering it's probably similar or close to your research. I know that there's like some accusations of misuse of funds by the BLM founders.
Yeah.
And I just looked it up because I've seen it here and there, and most of the sources were not good sources. They were just like right-wing things, but there was like 1 or 2 decent sources that touched on it. I was wondering if you know anything about that, and if you've looked into it recently.
I had just heard about it the other day, something about the purchasing of like, an extremely expensive home, possibly mansion, misappropriation of funds. I'm not sure. I mean, one of the things that I say comfortably in this phase of my life, right? Like I sit here as like the middle-aged woman reflecting back, and I think about the women in MBFO that are looking for boyfriends. One of the things I don't mention is one of the reasons why Combahee disbanded is because some of them started sleeping together. So they got girlfriends and then they broke up, right? But like young people misappropriating funds, sleeping together, that's one of the ways SNCC had problems, because Black men were like, oh my God, we could sleep with a white woman, right? It kind of feels like this is what young people do, right? So BLM is like, oh my gosh, we can get Cash App, millions of dollars, and like get a big house. Is it disappointing? Sure. Is it surprising? Not so much, right? I mean, it's not surprising that the only woman that led the Panther Party was Elaine Brown. Why? Because she was Huey Newton's lover. So when he goes to prison, he's like, we'll put Elaine in charge. Why? Because he thinks he can control her, right? So if you don't know that story, you're like, oh, it's Black women's leadership. Not so much, right? So it's like, I don't know what BLM is doing, but if there's something, untoward, to me, that's kind of par for the course, right? And also when we talk about organizing and activism, not much different than the elected folks, right? Like, what's Jenny Thomas doing, right? What's Clarence Thomas doing? What was Trump doing? I don't know what any of these people were doing. So, I mean, I'm not even sure what our expectations even can be for people that do this kind of work. Yeah, Elliot, and then my guy.
So first, well, thank you for the talk. Also, thank you for the print slides and the reality TV shout out, all the things that I love. I have two questions, but there's one that I'm really thinking about. Is one of the things that's very clear in your talk today, right, is something that I think some of us know, right, is that history isn't this kind of up thing, right, but rather these kinds of highs and lows, these ebbs and flows that kind of go on. And I'm curious, actually, as a professor talking to students, when you talk about these seemingly open moments of hope, right, that we see now, that we saw in 92, and then there's the backlash. How do you as professor, I guess, encourage students to still remain hopeful, either in electoral politics or just really sort of politics in general?
Sure. I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think sometimes you have to read the room, right? So, I mean, when Obama got elected, I was like, I will say nothing, right? I mean, I had some things in my mind, but I mean, in that moment, there was nothing you could say other than let's just celebrate and dance, and it's going to be fabulous. And, that's what you do. I think it's easier when you're kind of like past a hope moment, or if you have a hope moment that isn't of the student's generation, then it gives you like a pocket to analyze, because these students don't have, George Lipsitz talks about possessive investment, right? They don't have a possessive investment in Bill Clinton. These students don't even know. They're like, when I say Clinton, they think I'm talking about Hillary, right? And then they're like, oh, that guy. Right. I mean, but they don't know anything about him. And so to have a critique of that doesn't feel the way it would feel that if we found out something difficult about Tarana Burke and students really admire everything that she's done with Me Too. Okay. Yeah. Let's see here, because the question is so long. Okay, thank you for your talk. Okay, great. Can you just discuss a little more about the exclusion of Black women's, give me 1 second, concerns in the 60s by Black men, what Black women did, how they persisted to become visible and included in reports, numerous suggestions, including events, the eventual funding of Head Start. I think what was important about the Black women who were a part of the Kennedy Commission is that they had prominent roles in other spaces and access to other reporting medium, right? So, I mean, one of the things that I don't mention is, not being reported in the New York Times is not the end of the world for Black people, right? Black people have always had the Black press, and Black people knew that they wanted Head Start and needed Head Start. And so there always been ways to get around these things. And so someone like Dorothy Height, who was the head of the National Council of Negro Women, she was the president of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. She was tapped into all kinds of spaces. She was able to get her message out, right? It's just in a different place, right? And when you are not central to these documents, you can't even be upset if you're not in the final report, right? You know that you'll get the knowledge from the report out to the people that need to get it. I think John had something. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, that's Adrian, Gloria. Up here? I just read that one. Adrian Christensen? Okay. President Biden seems to be trying to make amends for his role in the Anita Hill hearings. But I wonder if you think he is likely to back the Black women in his administration when the right-wing media starts going after Black women, including making things up and twisting women's words, like in the case of Shirley Sherrod. Your final slide seems to suggest that the future is bright for Black women in politics. I worry that might not be true. That said, I'm thrilled about Justice Jackson's new seat. So Adrian, you said it exactly like what I would think, that like on a day like today, like when Elliot is saying, how do you, have people have hope and, be cautious. Okay, so on the day the confirmation comes through, like we're gonna have to do the hallelujah dance. Like I can't come in here and be like, oh, it might not work out. Now you all know, like there's probably going to be some problems. But on a day like today, you have to celebrate it. What's Biden going to do? I think Biden's going to do what the office of the presidency does. And the office of the presidency isn't Biden any more than it's Trump, than it's Obama, than it's Clinton, than it's any of them. It's the office of the presidency. And they're going to try to maintain that. And if Black women are collateral damage, then that's what happens. Yeah.
So I'm gonna read
Thank
some
you,
of the
because
questions.
I clicked it by
Yes,
accident.
I saw
and
that.
and that's much more helpful because I'm over here. I can't even see it.
One comes from sorry. So one actually comes from Ayan first that I'll read, and then I'll go to Vinay's second. So I'll talk to Jan, who says, "Hi, former advisor. So nice to see you. Screaming congratulations and waving hi. Could you elaborate on how you're contextualizing the post-Obama moment with Kamala Harris, as well as Justice Brown, and where do you see the future of Black feminist politics going?"
Well, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I am a part of around 8 academics who are part of something called the Kamala Harris Project, and it's housed in the University of Southern California. And 4 of us have an expertise on Black women in politics, and the other 4 have an expertise on Southeast Asian women in politics. And we, of course, are like, following her, but it's difficult. It's not an apples to apples comparison because she's a vice president, right? So vice presidents do things differently than presidents. And it's also still early on enough that it's very difficult for me to have like an assessment of what her role is. For those of you all who might not know some things about her background, what's fascinating is that she kind of comes from radical parents, right? So when her mom was in graduate school, her mom was like in a Marxist reading circle with Cedric. I took a class with him. Cedric Robinson, like they were buddies. Cedric Robinson wrote the seminal text on Black Marxism, right? Now, Kamala Harris is no Black Marxist, right? But like that's who raised her. And so that's why these ties to, these outside like threads of thought are so fascinating. And then her dad was an economist and trained Lisa Cook, who now is trying to get into the Obama administration in his like economics division of his administration. And so she is tough to read because she also was really tough on crime when she was attorney general, and people had lots of problems with that. But I feel like it's still too early. Where Black feminist politics is going, I really always look at what the activists are doing outside of the machine. The machine can't move without the people outside of the machine moving it. And so one of the ways in which Black Lives Matter pushed Hillary so much was like at the very end of her campaign, when they get to the convention, she ends up deciding to let the Mothers of the Movement, which is an organization of Black women whose sons have been killed by the police, come and be on the stage during the convention. If you're a progressive, you're like, so what, big deal, right? If you were a mainstream Democrat, like if you were like a Humphrey Mondale Democrat, like those people were appalled. And so, but like Hillary didn't do that on her own. She had to be pushed to do that.
So you kind of talked about this in terms of Ayan's question, but really Vinay was also asking a question about Vice President Kamala Harris, and whether or not she's very kind of sort of reminiscent of Obama, and she seems a bit muted in the Biden administration. Do you have anything to kind of elaborate on that?
Once again, I think it's hard to define muted, right? Because was Biden muted next to Obama? The vice president is often muted, right? And so part of it is like, I think we will know more if Biden decides not to run again, right? And that's not too far, like we're 2 years out from that, right? If she runs for president, that's an entirely different narrative. That's an entirely different book, right? And so that's a very different thing.
Great. There's a question from there's a question from Michelle Miller, who's asking whether or not you have any thoughts on Stacey Abrams and how she fits in this.
Yes. So, once again, I only had so much time that I could talk. I mentioned Stacey Abrams in the book. I think what she has done for organizing and pulling together people and voter registration, that's the template, like that's the new model. And I think that she has had as much influence, possibly even more, in the role with that than if she'd been governor of Georgia. See, one of the things that's dicey about these things is that once you hold certain offices, then you really can't have the influence, right? So people who were disappointed in Obama didn't realize if you're looking for someone to push, that's Clyburn, right? That's more the Congressional Black Caucus. That's really not the Oval Office. So if she were the governor of Virginia, I don't know if she could move things the way that she was able to with the organization that she has. And that's not saying that there wouldn't be value in her being the governor of Virginia, but there are limits to these roles.
All right, I have another question from Dr. Cheryl. So Dr. Cheryl Anderson wants to know whether or not you've ever lectured in the state of Texas. She proceeds to say that in the state, your books are on the banned list.
That's true.
In the schools.
Thank you.
And there is really
Somebody
something
clap.
to be said or heard there.
Yeah. Funniest thing in the world. Someone actually that I went to graduate school with that I hadn't heard from in probably 20 years sent me a note and said, "Do you know you're being banned in Texas?" And I was like, "Shut up." I was like, "I love that." I was like, "Don't tease. I hope it's true." Yeah, so those are my books that are written for 4th to 12th graders. So you saw the jacket cover of the Carol Moseley Braun book. That was written for young people. As shocking as it may seem, there are some parents that don't want people to know this. And so I have spoken in Texas. In fact, when I was on sabbatical a few years ago, I flew to Texas 7 times to speak because Texas really is a hotbed of educational materials, and it's partly because of how their school board is set up. Their school board is not elected. School board is appointed by the governor, and they've had a Republican governor for so long. That is why Texas educational products have like the politic that they do. And what I mean by the product is that less than 10 years ago, they had textbooks that said that slavery was immigration. And so someone had to come forward and say, that's not accurate. And millions of dollars were lost. It was a lawsuit. The books had to be pulled. But it took actually a Black parent to come forward and say, you know what, slavery really was not immigration. And these probably should not be the school books in public schools. But there's something about that George Floyd book that I wrote that they don't seem to appreciate. I don't know what that is.
All right, we have another question from Tia Simone Gardner, doctor, who wants to know if you have any thoughts around Ilhan Omar and very much the mobilization of the right around her and the squad, and basically its own kind of relation in the history around Black feminism and the Combahee River Collective.
You know, I love that question because one of the things that I need to be clear about in my research is that I'm writing about Black American women, right? And Kamala, her dad is Jamaican immigrant, her mom is from India. But for the most part, I'm really writing about Black American women. And I think what complicates this is with all the African immigrants we have, and also Caribbean immigrants, you know, that is a different narrative, right? Because I think what Ilhan is doing is perfect for what she's doing, right? Like that's exactly what the 5th district wants because it's so Somali, right? I think that, you know, Somali politics look differently from Southern Black politics, right? And so I think that that's someone else's research. And I think it's research that's on the rise because I think that we are going to have more people in office that come from backgrounds that are different from the people that I'm writing about. And just for clarification, you know, Shirley Chisholm was Caribbean, but her Brooklyn identity and representation reflected what their politic was. She was one of the few people to ever go to Congress, and her initial meeting was to say she didn't want to be put on the committee assignment she was given. And people were like, who in the world does she think she is? Like the white guys wouldn't do that, right? But she was put on the agricultural committee. She's like, I'm from Brooklyn. Like you put me here so that I would be ineffective and I'm not going to be on the agricultural committee, right? But this whole thing about African politics and Caribbean politics, you know, I want to give respect and say that is different.
Actually, I want to follow up with that. I just have a question about Michelle Obama, and if you
Yeah.
could speak about her impact on Black feminist thought or
Sure.
politics.
Sure. So like in my 3rd edition, I said, you know, 2017, you have like a lot going on, right? So you have Michelle Obama moving out of the White House. It's the 40th anniversary of Combahee. You know, what I think Michelle Obama does is she gives Black people permission to embrace Obama in a way that they first did not know how to embrace him. Right. And that is partly because of his background. Right. And the fact that she is from Southside, her family was actually connected to Jesse Jackson's family. She was good friends with one of his daughters. She was able to bring, like, you know, because Southern Black people were like, who is people? Right. They were like, what? You know, and she brought him to like Trinity Church, right, which was like the church in Chicago, even though he ends up denouncing the pastor. And so what she does, right, is kind of give a Black American blessing to someone that people, some folks were like, he's a Kansas Kenyan. I don't know nothing about him. I don't know nothing about his people. And what's that all about? And so I feel like she played that critical role. I think his daughters pushed him on the gender issue. So when he was in the Senate, he was like, gay marriage, like not necessary. They can have civil unions. You know, I'm not going to do any of that. And I understand his daughters gave him a really hard time. And then also when donations were coming in from wealthy gay people, then he ended up like changing his tune a little bit and jumped on board with gay marriage.
All right. We have we have one more question from Dr. Bernadette Harrell. And so the question is essentially, so what do you think the sort of CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, needs to do to really shape this next generation?
Wow. You know, I think that the Congressional Black Caucus is actually the most influential aspect of electoral Black politics. Right. What happens in city council is critical. What happens in state legislatures and mayors. But what's fabulous about the Congressional Black Caucus is that as a bloc, they can influence. And so I think the power that they could have on this younger generation is helping them understand what they do. And I don't know how this would be operationalized, but find a way for internships to happen that kids could afford to have. Right. Because that's a critical thing. You have to be in a certain class position to be like, mom and dad, I want to live in DC and the rent is going to be $1,000 a week. And this internship with the Congressional Black Caucus doesn't pay. Right. That's a big ask. But for people to know who they are and what they do, shadow them, learn about them. That's key. Right. I mean, when you think about what Cory Booker did in the hearings for Ketanji Jackson Brown, where he just said, I'm going to stop and pause. No one's going to steal our joy. And when I see you, I see my mom and all that. Like Black kids in America, I don't know if they even know who Cory Booker is, but they should. And they should know what he said about her. Oh, wait. My former professor, Sarah Evans, has something to say. I can't believe you're here. I could cry. I'm so happy. Oh, Elaine, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Elaine. I'm sorry. Mhm. 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 Sh- Sure. And I'll say, so before I answer, Elaine Tyler May, who's chair of the department when I was in graduate school, who's president of the American Studies Association in '96, and who came to our wedding, right? So I know who you are. Um, my apologies. I know who you are. This is the one hope I do have with countering voter suppression is the hope of this generation and a cyber movement. Okay. And so when I think about what Elisa Garza and Opal Tometi and their friends did when Trayvon Martin was killed, and they said hashtag Black Lives Matter, and there are 5 million tweets in one day, which in 2012, there was no such thing as 5 million tweets in one day, right? And to give you an idea, Twitter had only been around a couple of years in 2012. What people can do now with the internet, I am hoping that we can get around picture ID for voting. And I'm hoping that at some point we'll be able to vote online. Because if we get a movement from young people where folks can vote from their phone, right, that could be a way to get around this. I think it is going to be a tough hurdle because I think that Obama was disruptive. I don't think that people expected as many white people to vote for Obama, right? Because Black people by themselves couldn't have done it. But I don't think that they expected for Black voter turnout to be what it was. And so, now that we've had this tremendous pushback, I think hopefully organizing some folks and for us to like possibly bring this into cyberspace could be a way to get around this. But it's not going to be easy. I mean, the whole journey hasn't been easy, right? Oh, why would they want to do that? Stop share. Right there.
Oh, yes, thank
There
you.
you go.
Thank you.
Awesome. Good grief. I don't want to see me. All right. No, I'm good.
Online and here with us today. It's been wonderful to have you. It's really, truly an honor to have you speak for the David Noble Lecture because of your relationship to our department and with David Noble. So please join me in giving just another round of applause. Thank you.